Timothy Snyder is already waiting. I know that there is quite a few of you who would have loved to have him here, because for many of us, he is a hero. He is for me, because I remember that many, many years ago, when he got the Hannah Arendt Prize in Bremen, he offered a seminar, and that was shortly after he had written Bloodlands. And this book is such an eye-opener. It is, I would say, everybody who enters the German Bundestag or any political parliament, at least in Europe, should read Bloodlands, because then you understand. Timothy is already listening. Timothy is a professor of history and global affairs at Yale University, but he stays in Vienna most of the time, I think, at the Institute for Human Sciences. And like I said, he has been writing a lot, but Bloodlands, for me anyway, personally, still is the main opus. And it's so many years ago that he wrote it, and it's unbelievable that all the traces he has been following are now showing up again. That is what we call the long lines of history. So we will hear from Timothy about the traces, about incitement to genocide, what it takes to prepare the road to then kill people and try to exterminate a whole people. And then we are glad to have Sir Adam Roberts. I don't see him at the moment. Ah, there he is, sitting in the back. Okay, very modest. He's a senior research fellow in international relations at Oxford University. He has been the president of the British Academy, and he has been, I think, like Gordon Wayne, given expert and advice to parliaments, and committees, to governments, and to public inquiries. So we are really happy that you made this long way with the nasty airports we usually have. So thank you all very much. Timothy, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Marieluise. Thank you all for being there. I'm very glad to be in the company of Adam Roberts, who was one of the people I learned from when I was a graduate student. I asked to speak about the question of intention, because it seems to me that in this discussion about genocide, we are in a very odd place. It seems to me that the genocidal intent of this war has been clear even before the war itself began, that the proclamations that Mr. Putin issued at the very latest in July of 2021 were openly genocidal, and that the language that he used in the days running up to the war was also clearly genocidal. It troubles me, and I'll just say this at the beginning, that the countries whose constitutional orders, Israel and Germany, and whose everyday political rhetoric are very much tied up to the historical fact of the Holocaust, have in general been so slow to recognize what I take to be the obviously genocidal character of this war. And I'm not speaking of societies now, but speaking of governments, have done so little to hinder it. I think there's a particular sadness in that. But let me take my time to make my argument about intention. It seems to me that in the discussions of intention, which of course is necessary according to the Genocide Convention of 1948, people get pushed back to a kind of naive construction of human nature where the posture is something like, we need to get inside that person's mind. And then the next move after that is to say, well, of course, we can't get inside that person's mind. And by that, in that way of seeing things, the entire 1948 Genocide Convention, and indeed the idea of genocide itself, becomes absolutely meaningless. If intention is something that can only be somehow produced by an X-ray of someone's mind, then obviously there's no such thing as genocide. So as a historian, I just want to make the point that the way we arrive at judgments about intent has to do with the contexts and the discourses and the circumstances. We can't expect to find some kind of clear X-ray. This is even true, of course, in the case of Adolf Hitler. I presume that everyone would take for granted that, you know, the anachronism aside, the Holocaust of the Jews was an example of genocide. But one would be, I think, hard-pressed to find the actual order or the actual moment where you could say, literally, here is the moment where we know what Hitler's state of mind was. The case for the Holocaust, the case of the intention, is built up by historians on the basis of circumstances and statements and conjunctures, which is what we have to do in real time as well. Now, I say this not because I think Germany now and Germany then and Russia now are exactly the same. I say it because I take it that Nazi Germany is an obvious case of genocide. And my point is that even these obvious cases of genocide, if we apply the standard of looking into someone's mind, we're never going to find what we're looking for. So let me just take a few minutes to supply what I think are a handful of pretty good historical indicators of genocidal intent. And I think these things are useful because we can draw them from cases where we've had more time to contemplate what's happened than the 8 months that we have with Russia. And then once we take them from history, we can apply them more quickly and perhaps come to the conclusion to which I believe we need to come. The first indicator of genocidal intent one could draw from colonial history, and it would be the description of a state as not a state. In general, colonial powers, when encountering other political units, did not recognize them as states, and that was generally the prologue to an indicator of a coming genocide. A second indicator comes from the 20th century, and that is the description of a people as not a people, a society as not a society, a nation as not a nation. So a social group is encountered, but it's not recognized as such. A third indicator, also coming from the 20th century, but of course also there are examples from before, but the third indicator would be the denial that people are human. So you encounter individuals, but you claim that for one reason or another, they're not actually human beings. A fourth indicator that we have from the late 20th century and into the present is retrospective. It's when people deny that a previous genocide has taken place, which in fact means that they desire to commit the genocide or the kind of genocide they're talking about. The obvious example here would be neo-Nazis who deny the Holocaust. And of course, the meaning of that is not that they factually deny the Holocaust. The meaning of it is that they desire such an event to take place. Another indicator, now moving from history into the present or into a theory which is decades old, but which is very much present around the world now, is what we now call replacement. The idea that other people are coming, they're taking our space, they're replacing us, and therefore we're right to replace them. Something like that was actually very present in the Nazi view of the world, and it is also very present, as I'm going to claim, in Putin's view of the world. The final indicator, which is very much from the present day, not historical, but which I think is worth mentioning because without it, it's hard to understand contemporary Russian practice. The final thing which is worth mentioning is a postmodern indicator. The postmodern indicator is that you overload the system. You basically supply so much evidence of genocide, both in theory and in practice, both in statements and in deeds, that people begin to ask, well, is this really genocide? And I realize that might sound paradoxical, but I think the problem, if anything, today is not that there's a lack of evidence. I think the problem, if anything, today is the overabundance of evidence, both in terms of the perpetration and in terms of the intention. And the very overabundance leads to a kind of perverse cycle where people think, I'm not sure this is genocide. And then they say, well, there's all this evidence, but therefore to convince me that it's genocide, I need still more evidence. And that cycle can continue indefinitely, and the standard for what genocide is then indefinitely raised. And I believe that's what's actually happening. I don't think the genocidal practices, and I'm sure this has been discussed elsewhere, are really in doubt. Every single practice that's mentioned in the second paragraph of the 1948 Convention has obviously been carried out. And I'm sure you all know that in the 1948 Convention, it's not just the genocide itself, but it's also incitement to genocide, which is listed as a crime, just as much as a crime. So all of the practices are there. I assume that that's pretty clear. I'm happy to talk about it later. What I want to talk about is how these 6 indicators of intention are clearly evident in the events of the last 8 months or even earlier. So the first thing I mentioned is the colonial indicator, the denial that the state is a state. Putin has been denying that Ukraine is a state since at least 2011, very clearly in 2013, before the run-up to this war in 2014. There was an onrush of such rhetoric in 2021, including a very long and specific essay. And during the war, there's been a systematic refusal to recognize the Ukrainian state as such, to recognize the Ukrainian government as such, or to recognize Ukrainian officials as such. And the way I'm putting it is very euphemistic. In fact, there's a systematic practice of applying abusive language to all institutions that might be Ukrainian. The second indicator from the 20th century that I mentioned is the denial that a people is a people. And here, of course, Hitler provides a very good example with the discussion of the Jews. In Mein Kampf and elsewhere, Hitler describes the Jews as not being of this earth. They're not attached to the land. They don't belong where they are. And this is actually strikingly similar to the way that Ukrainians are discussed by Putin and in Russian propaganda generally. The notion is that in Ukraine, there are real people, and those real people are Russians, but somehow they're governed by a thin layer of exotics, of people from elsewhere. Propagandists refer to these people variously as having been Poles or Habsburgs or Nazis or Jews or Europeans. It doesn't really matter, though. The theory is always the same. The people who call themselves Ukrainians are somehow from elsewhere. They don't really belong on the land. They are servants of an international conspiracy. Their loyalties are somehow elsewhere. And from that theory, it follows that if these people can be exterminated, then the natural order will be restored. The right people will be on the land, and they will understand themselves the way that they belong. That, of course, that is the logic of Mein Kampf, actually, with respect to the Jews. And it's a logic on display on Russian television today. I'll point to the recent appearance of Pavel Gubarov when he spoke of exterminating as many Ukrainians as had to be exterminated. This is the logic. We exterminate all the ones who think they're Ukrainians until we get to the point where we reach the people who actually understand that they are Russians. The third indicator from the 20th century also is the denial that people are human. And here I'll stay with that same clip from Pavel Gubarov, or I could also mention the ending of a recent propaganda program, the most important one led by a man called Solovyov, where we are confronted with the idea that Ukrainians are possessed, that the reason why there is Ukraine is that people are possessed by the devil. Now, this might seem like it could be something that's easily dismissed as laughable, but it is pretty widespread in Russian discussions of Ukraine. And one even finds it very prominently in the fascist theory of Ivan Ilyin, who is a thinker who Mr. Putin has cited consistently over the last decade or more, and most recently on September 30th in his speech about the referenda. In this idea, Ukrainians are actually, servants of Satan. This notion, of course, is very deeply rooted in Russian Christian nationalism or Russian Christian fascism, where, of course, Satan is associated with the Jews. So here we have an actual Nazi idea. The fourth criterion that I mentioned is the retrospective one, the denial that a genocide took place. And again, there's abundant evidence of this. The memory laws in the USSR, which forbid people from speaking of the 1939 alliance with Hitler, were strengthened right before this war began. The official policy on the Holodomor in Ukraine has been strengthened as this war has gone on. A monument to Holodomor, as I'm sure all of you know, was just brought down in occupied Mariupol. the gist of the Russian argument about Holodomor is that there couldn't have been a political motive. It was simply a natural disaster or some kind of administrative exercise. Meanwhile, even as Russians are saying this, they're trying to cut off water supplies and cut off power supplies so Ukrainians will suffer and die in the millions. When you deny that there's a political motive in the past, you're also denying that there's a political motive in the future. You're just saying that everything is natural and going the way that it should be. Number 5 is the contemporary replacement theory, the idea that we are being replaced by others, by other races. Putin himself is an advocate of this. His anxiety about Russian demography is well known. Replacement theory is all over the Telegram channels of Wagner, who are the people who are actually fighting much of the war in Ukraine. Wagner, of course, is a private mercenary group. They're fighting around Bakhmut. They're the ones who are trying to carry out an offensive. And I should note that in this replacement theory mode, the genocide that we're talking about is not limited to Ukrainians. Throughout the course of this war, males from the indigenous peoples of the Russian Federation, of the Eastern Russian Federation, the southern parts of the Russian Federation, have been sent in hugely disproportionate numbers to die on the front. Meanwhile, women and children from Ukraine have been deported into Russia on the theory that they are white, quote unquote, and therefore they can be assimilated into the Russian population. So there's an attempt at reversing what fascists see as replacement. A specific example of this are the Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of the Crimean Peninsula, who, of course, were subject to many waves of deportation. Finally, in the spring of 1944, under Stalin, every single last Crimean Tatar was deported. Since 1991, many have returned, but under the current Russian occupation, they're specifically targeted for oppression and right now specifically targeted for mobilization so that they can go and die elsewhere in Ukraine. So there's a genocidal element, I believe, to this as well, which goes beyond the Ukrainians. But the final point I want to make and to repeat and to close is the postmodern one, number 6. I think that Russia, as it does in other matters, is deliberately overloading the system. It's trying to make things hard to understand just by throwing too much evidence at it. This takes place in it takes place at a qualitative level when Russians claim that saying that Ukrainians are Nazis. This, of course, is confusing, but at its root is itself a fascist practice because it divides the world into us and them. It's a fascist practice in the sense that it's simply hate speech. When Russians refer to Ukrainians as Nazis, they just mean these are non-human people who deserve whatever they get. With the denial of the state, it's much the same way. There's so much of it that we lose our sensibility to it. And the same is true, I think, with the actions. Every day there's some action which violates the Genocide Convention. And I'm afraid that we become jaded. Over weeks and months, our sensibility is dulled, and we just expect more and more. So my final point is that we have to be very careful that we're not falling into some kind of perverse cycle. The evidence for intent here is very clear by historical standards. It's very clear. It's unusually clear. And I think if anything, the danger is that because there's so much evidence of intent, we'll keep stretching and reaching and hope and expecting that something even clearer will be delivered. But in my view, it's been very clear for a very long time. Thank you very much for your attention.
See, the interpreters really had to work hard, I would say. So many ideas and in such a short time. I want to pick up 1-2 thoughts which you hand over here, and there is a special, yes, it is a special sign that we are meeting here in the middle of Berlin. And yes, of course, Germany is the country where a genocide has happened in a way and in a dimension and in a matter that it actually, you can't think it, it's overcoming what our brain and our soul can understand. and you say, and I go with you, can you please take that out of there? Okay. I'm that a people like Germany and a political class who claims that again and again and again, they are going through their own history and working on it, that a country like that now is so reluctant looking at something which is happening in front of their eyes. And I think the trap is that we are sitting in this singularity. The trap is the singularity of the Shoah and the Holocaust, which was a genocide. And never ever again in this world can something like that meet what has happened in Germany or Poland or Ukraine with the extermination of the Jewish people. And this keeps us totally immune, acting like we would have to act nowadays when with a different face, genocide happens again. This is very important to us, and we have not gotten to our political class yet, that they really start accepting this idea. And the second point which you made, you very light-footed almost were talking about signs of fascism. And I would tell you, if you were here in Germany, maybe not in this audience, they would tell you, do you want to say that Putin is Hitler? And this is a total no-no. So again, it keeps us from looking at the structures, looking at differences, but as similarities, as a pattern. So this is part of the German immunity. It is a tragedy. We should be standing in the first row. When we claim that we have been working on our history, we should be standing in the first row to recognize when there is a genocidal war, when it is going to happen, when it's on the way to happen. And number three, Wayne Gordon said this morning, don't try to get all the proofs you can collect. Ukraine is too huge. There already have been too many crimes being committed, and we'll never be able to get the names and all the proofs. Wayne said, please look for patterns. And I think Mariupol was a very clear pattern. And what is coming now and has started since 2 weeks, destroying the possibilities to live, especially in a winter, is a very clear pattern too. So this is what we take out from your speech. Professor Adam, we ask you, with your long-standing experience, to pick up, go along with what Timothy Snyder presented.
Is this working?
It's
okay. Tim Snyder's presentation was so impressive that I think the best thing I can do is to tear up my boringly factual, tediously detailed notes and structure my remarks around some thoughts that he provoked in this very impressive presentation. And let me say at the beginning that although I question the way in which we talk about genocide, there are some problems there. I'm not urging that we stop in any way the busy, multifaceted program of investigation that is taking place into genocide, including currently in Ukraine. I'm not suggesting, even for one moment, that there is no genocide going on. I am suggesting that there's one danger in all of this, which is that genocide has become, unfortunately, a term of abuse in politics rather than a precise term, although it is a term with a very precise meaning. I'm suggesting that what we need to do is to keep constantly in mind the close relationship between the genocide issue on the one hand and the laws of war on the other. And I intend to give some reasons why, even when accusations of genocide are made, in almost all cases, it would be prudent and wise and factually and legally correct to also encompass within the same prosecutions violations of the laws and customs of war. They should not be separated. And there are many cases in which the defendants have been accused both of genocide and of laws and customs of war, and may have been found guilty of one and not of the other. That happened at Nuremberg, although it was not, the word genocide wasn't used in that case, but the meaning was clear. And it happened in the tribunal for Yugoslavia, where Mladic, for example, was found to be guilty. In fact, he was found to be guilty of one crime of genocide, but not of another one with which he was charged, and also with violations of the laws and customs of war. I'm simply suggesting that this thing needs to be put into a clear-minded legal context in which we don't put all our assets into arguing for or about genocide, but also encompass these other aspects, which in some respects may be easier to address in a wide range of tribunals, not just the top-level international criminal tribunals, but national tribunals and many others. So that's just a general part of my approach, and it's a distinction between what I was advocating and what Tim Snyder was very eloquently saying to us. Now, the second issue I want to raise is when, and I think the only sentence in Tim Snyder's presentation with which I actually disagreed, when he said, if I have got it right, that incitement is just as much a crime as aggression itself. And that is not necessarily true. The Genocide Convention is worded on that point in such a way that incitement is clearly a public crime. It is punishable, but it's not necessarily exactly equivalent to genocide itself. And it's no point in getting involved in a tangle over this issue as to whether incitement does or does not count as full-dress genocide. The point is that it's punishable. And so it's a very minor disagreement we have on that point. The larger point on which I had some worries was about the connection, and this was also a point I had in today's discussions more generally about war crimes and what to do about them, is the connection between war crimes tribunals on the one hand and power politics on the other. And I want to suggest that the power political background of War Crimes Tribunal is extremely important. And while we may all sympathize with or be close to the purist view of law as something that is there to redeem the sins of international relations, it is also true that war crimes tribunals tend to depend upon the state of power politics, and where that is wrong, the tribunals may well fail. Let me just give a couple of examples. One, the Nuremberg Tribunal. It is often criticized as a tribunal which would introduce important new legal concepts, and indeed it is sometimes praised for having done so, and in my view, rightly so. It's also criticized as being victor's power, a victor's tribunal, and that is somehow seen as a criticism. Actually, to be precise, it wasn't exactly, or not typically, victor's tribunal. It was the tribunal of victors who had demanded unconditional surrender. They had under their control already the people they wanted to try. And the trials at Nuremberg could take place against that clear power political background. And where such a clear background is not there, it's likely to be much more difficult to obtain convictions. I could also give, as an example of the importance of power politics, the Yugoslav tribunal, which I have followed very closely since it was merely an idea. I've known some of the people who implemented it and admired them, but there are ways in which that tribunal could only operate because of changes in the power political situation. Let me just give the main example, I think, and one which John Kornblum, who is in this room, can testify to, because he was part of the process. That when at Dayton, Ohio, the peace agreement in the Yugoslav wars was finally concluded, or to at least some of the wars in the former Yugoslavia, there was a formal agreement that was forced on all parties, all signatories to Dayton, that they would cooperate with UN institutions relating to the wars in Yugoslavia, which was code for the International Criminal Tribunal. And even Milosevic was forced to sign this, and John Kornblum told me that he actually stood in the way of Milosevic when he tried to get out of the room before that final paragraph was added, and would not let him do so. That is power politics having an influence on law of a quite, and for law of a quite remarkable kind. So that issue of a connection between power politics and the law has an obvious relevance to what we're now confronting. Because to put it no more strongly, it seems extremely unlikely that there will be a situation where an international tribunal set up by primarily Western countries will be able to get its fingers on Putin or any of his close associates. I don't say impossible. And there is a history in Russia, as all the historians here can testify, of trouble in foreign wars leading to revolt and revolution at home. And that goes way up, not just an ancient time of 1905 and 1917, it goes up to Afghanistan and the failures there and the result in changes in the Soviet Union. There's a long history of interconnection which we ignore at our peril. And I think, I have to say it, I'm a great admirer of President Zelensky, but I think that the proposal for a new Nuremberg slightly exaggerates the potential that any tribunal might have to actually get its fingers on the people being dealt with.
Okay. Thank you, Sir Roberts.
Could I say a word?
Yes, definitely you will. Yes, of course. Please. Before you answer, and this is a really very interesting debate, and that's why I'm not going to allow you to intervene, but give it back to Timothy Snyder. Has the fact that there was an international convention on genocide agreed on in 1948 as a general international law, has that to a certain extent healed the problems Sir Roberts just talked about, especially when you mention Nuremberg, where there was not a basis, and maybe that was the development and the consequences of the experience of Nuremberg. Maybe you, since you want to answer anyway, Tim, you can give us a little answer, taking into account this idea.
It's certainly very important. If you look at the structure of Russian memory law, which is an implicit justification of the war in Ukraine, Russian memory law takes Nuremberg as its basis, because on the logic that the only atrocities which ever took place were the ones which were prosecuted at Nuremberg, and therefore everything else is essentially fair game. And the next step they take is they say, anyone who speaks of any other crime, be it a past Soviet crime or a present Russian crime, is thereby denying Nuremberg and thereby denying the horror of Nazi Germany. So the universality of the 1948 Convention is, of course, very important. And it's one way, I mean, stepping aside from the practicalities of prosecution, it's one way for us to think our way out of the propaganda trap which Russia thereby sets. The propaganda trap that Russia sets for Germany is precisely to say the only crimes were the ones that were prosecuted at Nuremberg. Everything else is not really a crime. Let us all, you and we together, focus upon those crimes and look away from the crimes that are taking place now. I simplify somewhat, but that is the basic logic, which leads me to a point I wanted to make in response to Adam Roberts, which is simply to completely agree with him that as a matter of jurisprudential practice, one ought to be bringing people before courts for crimes against humanity or war of aggression, in addition to genocide. I completely agree with that. I did not mean to suggest that we should only be prosecuting for genocide. I believe that the question of what is actually happening and what can be prosecuted are different questions, because I think it's meaningful. There's a meaningful difference between saying there's a murderer on the loose and there's a manslaughterer on the loose. I think if we face what I take to be the obvious screaming certainty that what is taking place in Ukraine is a genocide, whether we can prosecute it or not, that does lead us to different moral and political conclusions, including the kinds that Adam Roberts is referring to when he speaks of power politics. If we want there to be any sort of justice for any of these crimes, the Ukrainians have to win the war, and as quickly as possible. And I think that the more clearly we understand the nature of these crimes, the more likely it is that we will be in a position to help the Ukrainians to do so. The last thing I wanted to say, Marieluise, was in response to your remarks. I think that you made quite well the point that I was trying to make, namely that when Germans treat Hitler and the Holocaust as being outside of history, they actually make it impossible to draw any historical lessons from Hitler and the Holocaust. And Russian propagandists, understanding this weakness in Germany, play on this theme constantly, and unfortunately, and with great success. The thing, though, the additional problem, which I know you know about, but which I also want to mention, is the traditional, the uninvestigated German colonial history with respect to Ukraine, which I think is a separate and independent vulnerability. It's harder to see a country's existence being denied or a society's existence being denied when your own country did that also in the past, and when that history has not really ever been closely investigated or interrogated. And I'm afraid that's also the case in Germany. Thanks.
I think, Timothy, you're totally right. That is why your Bloodlands was so unbelievably important, because our generation has been raised with the idea that the Shoah and Auschwitz are the two, they belong together. Shoah is Auschwitz. Shoah is gas, is burning the people. And thus we really, for many, many years, did not look at Belarus, did not look to the Baltic states, and especially not to Ukraine. And it's only slowly that we are starting to understand that probably 1.5 million people have been killed one by one. So it was not only some SS people, but it was really many, many, many fathers, uncles, grandfathers who were involved to kill so many people. And I think there's a reason we didn't really want to look at that. And the Wehrmachtausstellung, which started 25 years ago and our society almost exploded, was a sign that we really did not want to have a full look. And you name it, when you talk about this war now, there is still many Germans who say our historical responsibility is towards Russia. We are responsible for the death of 27 million Russians, and we don't say Soviet people from the Soviet Union, and this was Ukraine. This is changing, though, since So Roberts, do you want to?
I'd rather hear from the others.
Rather from the others. You are very democratic. Wayne. Yeah.
Thank you. Wayne Jordash from Global Rights Compliance. I wanted to just ask Timothy a question, and it follows up from what Adam Roberts raised about alternatives. I think there's, obviously, when you go to trial, you want to have alternatives, you want to have a crime against humanity and perhaps an alternative of genocide. But what I want to sort of ask you, Timothy, is whether you entertain the possibility that genocide post 24th of February was really a last resort for the Kremlin. And I say that because if you look at the violence right at the beginning, at the 24th of February, the week or so after that, the violence looked to be of a completely different nature to what it escalated to. And it seems to me that there's a possibility that the violence at that stage was designed on the false premise that 50% of the Ukrainian population were going to support the Russian takeover. We need to conduct some violence to intimidate another X percent, and before we know it, we've got 60, 70% supporting the takeover. When that failed, the violence then escalated. So do you entertain the possibility that genocide was a last resort rather than the primary approach?
No, I don't. I think actually the logic of the question points to the opposite conclusion. Genocide is not measured by the number of people that you're thinking about killing or by the number of people that you kill. Genocide is measured by the intent to destroy people in whole or in part, and the misapprehension of the perpetrator of who those people are, or how many of them there are, I don't think mitigates the crime. So as I read the situation, the intention was genocidal from the beginning for precisely the reason that you give. Their understanding, the Kremlin understanding, was that there weren't really that many Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were a kind of elite, an artificial elite, concentrated in the cities. They were the kind of people who we would refer to as civil society, the more active participants in politics, what have you. And their notion at the beginning was that if they can round up this relatively small group and kill them, then the remainder of Ukrainian society, and I think they believed it was much more than 50 or 60%. I think they thought at the beginning, again, I'm emphasizing the logic of your question, not denying it. I think at the beginning, they thought it was more like 90%, that once they kill this artificial elite, then the healthy masses will return to Russia. And that logic is actually spelled out with absolute clarity in the article which appeared in RIA Novosti a day or two after the attack, or maybe 3 days after the attack. The article which was accidentally published, which was premised on the idea that Russia had won the war in those 3 days. There it's made clear that the idea was we clear away this artificial layer and then the healthy masses return to us. But what I want to say is that that is genocidal. If you think that you can destroy a national group by physically exterminating its elite, that's a genocidal intention. If, having failed to do that, you discover that there are more people who belong to that group, and you decide that more people have to be destroyed, it's the same genocidal intent, just applied to a larger group of people. And in that sense, more horrible because applied to more people. But I think what you're actually describing is a logic of quantitative escalation, which follows from a misapprehension of who the Ukrainians actually are. But I think the consistent element running through all of it is that the Ukrainian people are to be eliminated as such.
I don't see anybody raise their hands. I think, Timothy, what you just explained to us again, and actually we know it, it's not about numbers. It's not about numbers, it's about the intention. And that makes so clear that we should not have started to talk about the possibility of genocide or this genocidal war now half a year later, where the atrocities are so huge. But that really, actually, we had the instruments, at least in February, after all what was written and said by Putin himself, by his propaganda people in the state TV, we could have known very, very early. And since, to come back to it, it's about the responsibility to protect and the prevention of genocide. We really have been waiting way, way too long to really give a very decided answer. And being in Germany, and there will be a debate now, we still are not decided to really, really do as much as we can and give the Ukrainians what they need and what they're asking for. And that is really a shame for a country like Germany, which claims that there is no country in this world which has been dealing with its own history and the atrocities as much as Germany has done. So, thank you very much, Timothy. We would have loved to have you here, but we understand that traveling takes away a lot of your time and we need you. And so it was wonderful that you gave us the chance on this way. And thank you, Sir Roberts, coming from Great Britain.